Following the era of the Civil War, a great westward expansion coincided with the rise of industrial America. The first transcontinental railroads facilitated rapid migration to the western frontier. The state of Colorado would be admitted to the Union in 1876, and small mining towns began springing up deep in the Rocky Mountains. In the remote southwest corner of the state, underground gambling interest held a significant influence in a burgeoning railroad town. A newly elected sheriff would boldly act to shut down the illegal gambling operations. But by daring to challenge the gambling interests, the sheriff had unknowingly made a high-stakes wager of his own. Headlines of the sheriff's tragic death during a gunfight on Main Avenue would soon reach Denver. Strangely, it was no outlaw gunslinger on the other side of the gun. The man who pulled the trigger also donned a badge of law. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad laid tracks to the southwest corner of Colorado in 1880 to facilitate mining operations for silver and gold deep in the heart of the San Juan Mountains. At the base of the mountains, a thriving railroad hub developed rapidly, eventually being established as the town of Durango.
Well, Durango is the typical western town, and when you start, people just came in and settled. There was no city government, there was county government. Durango grew almost overnight, from nobody being here till over 2,000. And the growth was what spurred a lot of the problems, because the county had never had that many people in its whole history. And so they didn't have enough county deputies and all to try to keep law and order in the town. And typically, a western town is that way. There's lawlessness until you get law and order.
Durango actually was the real Wild West. It was a land of opportunity which attracted diverse cultures and people. It was, the gambling took place, the saloons, the alcohol flowed, prostitution was here, and it was not unusual to find shootouts to settle an argument, because you didn't have a law to settle the argument, and also to have some illegal hangings from the hanging tree by the post office. Durango was founded in September of 1880, but the Durango Police Department wasn't founded until May of 1881. And that was due to the pressure, a lot of the Victorian ladies, but also due to the pressure of the citizens wanting some law and order. It was just so out of hand, and the Sheriff's Department just could not handle it.
A gambling scene thrived among Durango's many saloons, despite the fact that it had been outlawed by the Colorado legislature.
The state of Colorado, and as well as the city, had prohibited gambling, but it didn't stop it, because gambling was part of life. And after all, if you're in mining, you're gambling your life every day you go underground. They passed the ordinances, it looked good in the book, and then the other thing it did, by the way, you allowed it to flourish, and then you collected fines every week. And that paid for city government. It did for decades in this town.
It was suspected that the city police received bribes for keeping quiet as well.
I'm sure that the police were getting kickbacks, but it's kind of hard to pin it down. But they allowed it to flourish, again, because it attracted business into town. If you come down from Silverton, why would you come down to Durango? They came down here with maybe 6 months' pay, and they're going to blow it down here rather than Silverton.
Marshal Wickline and his night marshal, Jesse Stansel, seemed to pass a blind eye on the ongoing gambling activities. But newly elected Sheriff Bill Thompson was resolved to eradicate these well-known illegal activities from the saloons of Durango.
Gambling in the red light district and everything, saloons, they were part of the quote-unquote real West. And the change was coming. The rowdiness, the lawlessness, the winking at gambling in red light districts, that was changing because you want to have tourists here. You want to have people come in and settle here and live here. The law enforcement was supposed to uphold the law, county, city, and state. And Thompson decided to do it. At the same time, he was stepping on one of the economic pillars in this town.
Sheriff Thompson had homesteaded in the Durango area and was in the business of raising livestock before he became involved in law enforcement. Jesse Stansel had worked as a cowboy in Texas before moving his family to Durango, where he became a police officer. Jesse Craven Stansel stood 5 feet 11 inches, and as the son of a Confederate soldier, was certainly no man to back down from a fight. Sheriff William J. Big Bill Thompson was a large man, 6 feet 2 inches tall and 260 pounds. Both his tenacity and his formidable presence helped to keep the peace.
One thing to keep in mind is people weren't as tall as we are today. So he towered over everybody. I mean, he was a giant. And if I'd been a little kid and he barked at me, I think I'd probably left the county. So, I mean, it was good. If you're going to have somebody who's sheriff, you want him an opposing figure, because that in itself is going to calm people down.
Both men had run against each other in an election campaign for sheriff of La Plata County. Both men had strong supporters in the community, so the race was hotly contested. Newspaper editor David F. Day of the Durango Democrat zealously supported Thompson's anti-gambling platform, and with his help, Thompson would go on to defeat Stansel by a narrow margin of 201 votes. Many thought the prior election was the source of animosity between the two men. Overzealous friends behind each party spread stories calculated to make men fight. But Thompson and Stansel had come to a gentleman's agreement to run a clean campaign. It was the contention over the gambling issue that fueled even more bitter feelings than an election ever could have generated. Over the months leading up to Thompson's death, there were two very openly avowed groups, either in favor of closing gambling or allowing it to continue, in a rebellious disregard for a law produced on the other side of the Rocky Mountains in Denver. Thompson and Stansel essentially became the two men in power who represented each side of this dispute.
At that day and time, if you invest money, if you have extra money to invest, putting into a saloon with gambling was a very good operation. It was very profitable. Because the odds, the odds weren't in favor of the poor person who was gambling. The odds were always in favor of the house. It was a fast way to make money, faster than the legitimate business down on Main Street.
Thompson was fearless in his raids on the gambling halls in Durango as well as in the county. His enthusiasm and determination for shutting down gambling operations was often said to be fueled by alcohol and harsh language. And he was not afraid to challenge the city police about their disinterest in enforcing the law.
Thompson was warned by the editor a few days before the incident happened that they are out to get you. And now it's just assumed that they means the gambling operators, because they would be losing revenue off of the gambling and customers coming into their saloons.
The Durango Evening Herald referenced the men invested in the gambling operations as a gang, and this group of men were no doubt unhappy with the new sheriff threatening their money-making enterprise. It appears this intimidating bunch had somehow made their displeasure known to their greatest critic, editor David Day. He pulled Thompson aside one evening and warned him about the gang. "These fellows are going to do you up, and they are after me too. Bill, you know I am the best friend you ever had in La Plata County. You had better look out for these fellows." Sheriff Thompson seemed to be unfazed by Day's warning. Conversely, it seemed the gambling operators had the city police in their pocket.
Well, what had been going on for a long time in Durango was tension between the city police and the sheriff and the county, and it had been boiling, getting hotter and hotter, and people were taking sides, and there was a strong feeling that something was going to explode.
The city police also had a desk inside the El Moro saloon, which generated perceptions of an unscrupulous relationship with saloon establishments. In fact, it was said that the El Moro saloon had essentially served as a sort of police headquarters for the city police for 3 years.
Thompson charged the police department with abetting the violations of the very law that he was trying to uphold for the state of Colorado. Now, Stansel, according to the 1900 federal census, was a saloon owner. He's listed as a saloon owner. But he was also a night marshal on the police department.
Newspaper editor David F. Day had some suspicion that Marshal Wickline himself had some level of ownership in the El Moro. A rumor suggesting that Wickline, the chief of police, was potentially profiting from these illegal gambling operations in a more direct manner than simple bribes and fines. It appears that the editor had informed Sheriff Thompson of this rumor as the sheriff decided to target the El Moro in a surprise night raid. As fate would have it, Marshal Wickline would fall ill just a couple of days prior, appointing Jesse Stansel as acting marshal. The violent events of Tuesday, January 9, 1906, began to escalate one night prior in Durango's notorious saloon block.
Here we are today in the new El Moro saloon, which was the site of the historical shootout between Sheriff William J. Big Bill Thompson and the acting marshal of the police department, Jesse Craven Stansel, over 100 years ago. This was known as a very rough, lawless area. Women and children did not come into this block.
The sheriff likely knew of gambling in other establishments, but he and his deputy, Tom Riddle, went to the El Moro that night because of the saloon's suspected affiliation with the city police. The El Moro was said to have been the most recent saloon to open up gambling, likely as a means to compete with the other 11 saloons on the block. But the El Moro, along with several other saloons, did not have a means to hide gambling from detection, like other saloons that had private upstairs apartments. As a result, the proprietors of these saloons felt they were being discriminated against, and no doubt the inability to host gambling was hard on business. Emboldened by whiskey and a cigar while on duty, Thompson entered the establishment, keen on finding evidence of gambling. He and Riddle marched to the back of the El Moro, where they found a private room that had been recently partitioned off from the rest of the saloon. Inside, they found several men playing cards. Thompson accused them of playing poker, but they insisted they were not. When confronted by Thompson, the proprietor of the El Moro, John Hartman, denied the accusations. Thompson called him a liar, but Hartman seemed to show the sheriff attitude as he boldly offered to take the sheriff to where gambling was being conducted in several other saloons. Thompson declined his offer, saying that was his own business. He eventually spied a covered roulette wheel in a back corner of the saloon. As the sheriff left the saloon, he took the wheel with him, leaving behind a lonely wooden bowl. The sheriff deposited the wheel in a vault in the courthouse before returning to Main Avenue, where he and Riddle encountered police officer Theodore Dobbs. Thompson reprimanded him. "Why in hell don't you do your duty?" Dobbs replied, "I don't know of any gambling." Of course, this flew in Thompson's face as a complete lie. At the end of the night, Thompson was in the office of the Durango Democrat, where he spoke with General Manager Thomas Tully. While there, he confronted a man in the office named Fuller Hood. The sheriff had apparently got word that Hood had been a participant in a recent poker game on New Year's night. Thompson's actions on Monday night were essentially a raid on Stansel's home turf, and no doubt when he got word of the raid as acting marshal, he viewed this as a transgression against the police department.
Well, Thompson brought it to a head. He starts to raid, and if he's going to do one, he's going to do others. Obviously, the saloon keepers and their following are upset very much. And the merchants in town who hoped we got to do something about this because it's bad for our civic image, they were getting upset because why hadn't something been done? I mean, it's on the law books, it's on the books. Why are you allowing this to flourish? And so it was bound to happen, and maybe not with that kind of violence, but it was bound to happen, and it just happened on that day. I mean, both sides had had enough.
The next morning, Stansel was in the office of the Durango Democrat, demanding to know why Thompson had targeted the El Moro. Editor David Day made him aware of the rumors that Wickline had an interest in the El Moro. Stansel denied this, left the office, and returned with mortgage documents in an unsuccessful attempt to clear Wickline's name from the scandal. Meanwhile, Thompson made his rounds to various saloons, talking to the proprietors about alleged gambling. At 10 a.m., he was at the Horseshoe Saloon, where he spoke with proprietor Curly McBride.
He was known to have an occasional drink or more, and had been drinking the night before. He was also known to, when he visited these saloons, to have a drink, a friendly drink with the proprietors. But the citizens weren't sure whether he was intoxicated or not that day.
Stansel entered the Horseshoe while Thompson was at the bar and walked straight back to the toilet. The previous night's raid was the talk of the town, and McBride was apprehensive of trouble between the two. Stansel would have walked straight back out of the saloon without saying a word to anyone, but McBride stopped him and inquired about the health of Wickline. Was Stansel's quick trip to the bathroom a pretext for keeping tabs on the sheriff? Was he anticipating a confrontation? It's hard to say. Despite the tension in the air, neither man addressed the other about the previous night's raid. Thompson was later seen at the Bank Saloon, and before noon he was back in the El Moro, the same saloon he had raided the previous night. This time he was openly accusing proprietor John Hartman of running a gambling house for Marshal Wickline and the city police. A man named Jake Whedon saw Stansel sitting at the end of the bar and became frightened as he witnessed Stansel loading cartridges into a gun, which he then put in his overcoat pocket before walking outside the saloon. When Thompson left the El Moro about 11:45 a.m., Stansel was standing at the edge of the sidewalk near an electric light pole.
Thompson asked Stansel if he was aware of the gambling, and Stansel said, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. This frustrated Thompson. He didn't like that kind of reply.
James Asher was standing next to Stansel before the violence broke out. As the closest witness to the event, he recounted the conversation between the two as Thompson confronted Stansel. Stansel and I were standing by the trolley pole as Thompson came out of the El Moro, and approaching Stansel, he said, "There's gambling going on." Stansel said, "Yes, I guess so." Thompson said, "Well, goddamn you, why don't you just stop it?" Stansel said, "Don't goddamn me, Bill, I won't take it. I'm working for the city under orders of Marshal Wickline and the city council. You treat me like a man, and I'll treat you like a man." Stansel's seemingly civil demeanor rang in Thompson's ear as nothing but silver-tongued deceit. George Olbert, the owner of the Bismarck Saloon, a couple of doors south of the El Moro, was informed by a patron named George Goodman about the argument. Olbert left his saloon, accompanied by Goodman, moving up the sidewalk in hopes of de-escalating the situation. But his efforts were in vain as Main Avenue began resounding in gunfire. There were somewhere between 6 and 11 shots fired, according to witnesses. The two were never less than 8 feet apart. As they exchanged fire, they moved towards one another.
The anger and the frustration and the hatred had reached the boiling point. And they aren't very far apart, about a little bit farther than we are apart. And they started shooting, and they kept going right at each other, for heaven's sakes. I would have probably run, but that shows you the hatred of it, because you just don't start walking at somebody. You're trying to kill them. I mean, you're not trying to just wing them in the shoulder, which you didn't do.
Stansel reportedly jumped to evade Thompson's bullet, providing a moving target while firing back. Both were dead game for the duel, each fearlessly charging the other until they were within arm's length, at which point the gunfight took on hand-to-hand characteristics. Stansel used his left hand to knock Thompson's gun up, at which point Stansel placed the barrel of his revolver against Thompson's side and fired. Stansel's shots were aimed to finish the sheriff, with 2 shots through the neck and a final aimed at the sheriff's temple. The sheriff knocked Stansel's arm to the side, causing the shot to narrowly miss, striking the partition of the sheriff's nose and plowing a furrow on one cheek. Both men reportedly emptied their revolvers. Stansel attempted to reload his empty gun, while Thompson, with a fight still in him, attempted to strike Stansel with the butt of his gun. But Thompson was so badly wounded that he only made a waning fight. Later, when it was determined that he had been shot 5 times, the Durango Evening Herald would remark that it was incredible that the man was able to fight back at all.
Well, it's really amazing. If the ordinary person got shot as many times as Thompson got shot, and 1 bullet right through grazing the heart, I mean, I would think you would have, in the pain, the shock, and everything else, you couldn't have kept firing, which shows you the stamina and the determination, shall we say, of this man who could sit there and keep firing before just absolutely collapsing with several wounds that should have been mortal right off the bat.
Stansel was wounded as well, with 1 bullet to the chest, and he retaliated, striking Thompson severely in the head multiple times, while Thompson weakly defended himself with 1 arm. Stansel continued until Thompson finally turned away and bystanders told him to stop. Stansel re-entered the El Morro, while Thompson staggered away down the sidewalk. Stansel exited the El Morro wielding 2 guns in anticipation of finishing the battle, but Thompson was no longer looking for a fight. The mortally wounded sheriff staggered down the street, grabbing the door jamb of a barber shop momentarily, where he turned to David Hayes and said, "My God, Jess has killed me," after which he collapsed in the doorway.
It shows you the hatred. I mean, you just don't do that. Normal people don't react that way. Normal people can get in that situation, but the hatred and all the tension that built up and the pressure that was on from both sides, and I mean, I think if it happened, it was bound to happen that way.
39-year-old Marshal Stansel initially refused to surrender his guns until he was informed that the seemingly indomitable sheriff was incapacitated. He then handed his guns to Mayor Charles McConnell and asked for a doctor. As Thompson lay dying in the doorway of the barber shop, he called to the doctor who was attending him, "Doc, arrest that man. He murdered me." Thompson was transported to Oxnard Hospital in a horse-drawn ambulance with his son George at his side. But in transit, as the wagon crossed Main Avenue Bridge, the 48-year-old sheriff was declared dead. Headlines in Denver newspapers about Sheriff Thompson's death at the hands of the town marshal portrayed Durango as a lawless frontier town. The coroner's report, published in the next day's paper, reported that Thompson's body had 10 or 12 scalp wounds cut to the bone and was shot 5 times. Stansel was transported to Mercy Hospital, where a .32 caliber bullet was removed from his right lung with a favorable prognosis of recovery. An elderly bystander named John Accord was also wounded in the crossfire. A bullet had struck the base of his elbow, resulting in the amputation of his arm.
Citizens were shocked at the elevation of the argument, but they weren't necessarily surprised because everything had been building up. Thompson was a very dedicated lawman, a very strong man, and he just felt like he wasn't getting any cooperation. He didn't understand why he had to go through this every day. The citizens loved both men. Speculation was so high among the citizens. No 2 people see the same incident the same way. And it depended upon who you were supporting, Thompson or Stansel, as to what position that you might take in trying to place blame. But it got a little bit out of hand, and people were getting a little angry because of the loss, and awaiting trial, because the trial wasn't until March, that the Herald actually did print a short article asking the citizens to please quit speculating and to let the evidence stand up in court and let it be what it should be.
Two dueling newspapers at the time seemed to reflect this split in the community. The Durango Democrat immediately abandoned its support of Thompson, and long before the trial came to a close, made its own verdict, declaring Stansel innocent and asserting that Thompson was the aggressor. It criticized the Durango Herald for what it saw as coverage that was more sympathetic to Thompson, as allowing the mistruth to be spread among its readers. Editor David Day's immediate and complete abandonment of Thompson was surprising to readers. Perhaps Day believed his friend had lost his temper while under the influence of alcohol. But one is left to wonder if Day's dramatic editorial shift was the result of a fear that he might suffer a similar fate if he continued to stand in the way of the gambling operators. The coroner's inquest over Thompson's body was held the next morning, and it was determined that a bullet had entered through Thompson's back. This prompted authorities to arrest Jess Stansel at the hospital where he was recovering, charging him with murder of the sheriff. After an initial hearing of witness testimony, bail was set at $10,000. Astonishingly, within hours of adjournment, the entire sum of the bail was furnished. A $10,000 bail in 1906 would be equivalent to about $250,000 today.
And that $10,000 is just has always fascinated me, because at a day and time, if you were making $3 an hour, you were in good pay. Probably the judge thought $10,000 would never be raised. He'd be in jail till the trial, because there was always a concern he might skip. And so that money obviously came from people who had money, the gambling interests, the most ready cash. Because if a person had, in that day and time, if you had $500 in the bank, you were considered quite wealthy.
As it turned out, two men who paid Stansel's bail owned saloons with ongoing gambling operations. Curly McBride owned the Horseshoe Club and admitted to hosting gambling during the trial. Oswald Link was the owner of the Oriental Saloon, and in less than 6 months, he would be found guilty of keeping a place of gambling. Thomas H. Tully, manager of the Durango Democrat, also contributed, perhaps part of the paper's political decision, to abandon Thompson. Of the other three who contributed money to meet bail, one was a political figure, another a prominent businessman, the other a rancher. It would be hard to know what prompted these men to support Stansel, other than a personal relationship or the belief of his innocence. But there was also the possibility that the three men had a stake in the gambling rings themselves. All told, the men provided an extra $6,000 on top of the original $10,000 bail, forking out a total of $16,000, if for no other reason than good measure. It is unclear if the judge raised the bail at the last minute, or if the group of men simply wanted to demonstrate their overwhelming support of Stansel by producing bail in such excess. There was a great deal of support and mourning for Sheriff Thompson. Thompson had left behind a wife, 3 grown sons, and 2 young daughters. Mayor Charles McConnell decreed that all business should cease and all stores and offices close from 1 to 3 p.m. on Thursday, January 11th, for Sheriff Thompson's funeral. It was Durango's largest funeral, with 800 people in attendance. On March 31st, the criminal trial, case number 660, began with 90 minutes of opening arguments. The most important question at hand was, who shot first? The courthouse was packed every day as 50 witnesses testified over 9 days for a trial that would fairly be considered a massive snafu. The trial was politicized between opposing factions on the gambling issue. Newspapers like the Democrat were overtly partial and highly influential on the jury. The witness testimony was conflicting. Many believed Thompson fired first. Others said they seemed to fire at almost the same time. While one witness claimed Stansel fired first, and another claimed that the first shot was fired at Thompson's back before he turned toward Stansel. The court also found it strange that Thompson was only found with a light .32 caliber pistol the day of the gunfight.
The coroner removed a .32 caliber gun from Thompson. He usually carried a .45 revolver, so this was quite unusual.
Some witnesses say they saw him with his usual .45 revolver, while others claim to have seen the sheriff wielding both guns. Thompson's supporters felt the bullet evidence recovered from the scene suggested that the sheriff only fired once, even though the sheriff's revolver was found empty. Both sides of the court vocalized suspicion that Thompson's gun had been tampered with at the scene of the sheriff's death. In addition to the problematic testimony, mortician Fuller Hood testified that he had burned the sheriff's clothing the night of the shooting, therefore destroying important evidence. Interestingly, this was the same man who Thompson had accused of gambling the night of the raid on the El Morro. Several other witnesses claimed they overheard the mortician say prior to the trial that he had burned the clothing by the order of Coroner J.W. Lackey. This testimony cast suspicion on the doctor at trial. Lackey had been thoroughly involved in the events of the case. He had been at Thompson's side as he lay dying in the doorway of the barbershop. And as county coroner, he had conducted the first autopsy on Thompson, producing findings on the entry wound in the abdomen that days later would be contradicted by a separate panel of medical experts.
Well, the most amazing thing to me about the trial was why they got rid of the evidence in the clothing. That smacks them either being stupid or being involved somehow, because the clothing was going to tell you where the bullets were, but that was gone. The testimony, I am sure people perjured themselves. They just had to have. And again, the typical testimony was the saloon people, and they have a vested interest in it. So could you get a fair trial? No, you couldn't. Could you bring out much information? Well, only people's opinions. And they'd read Dave Day, they'd read the newspapers. I think everyone in town had an opinion. You couldn't, I don't know how they ever got a jury. How could you absolutely say that you did not have an opinion when you'd been reading about it, you'd been talking about it, you'd been speculating about it? So I don't know. I mean, it tells you something about the legal system in that day and time, especially, it's almost the same today. If you get something like that big, people are bound to have an opinion.
The prosecution had few key witnesses, and 3 of the strongest testimonies crumbled before the court. One man named Orrin Frary testified he overheard Stansel at the Durango Democrat the day of the shooting, making threats to resort to violence against Thompson. Speaking to David Day, Stansel remarked that he would not take from Thompson what Officer Dobbs had the previous night, that if Thompson accused him of taking bribes from the gamblers, there would be more human blood spilled on the street than could be cleaned up in a month. This shocking statement provided a new perspective on Stansel's motives and his willingness to commit violence against the sheriff. Just as shockingly, this testimony was stricken from the record by the judge on the grounds that, quote, the law recognizes no such thing as a conditional threat. This was devastating to the prosecution. In addition, the 2 men who claimed that Thompson did not shoot first had their moral character brought into question by the defense. Both were working-class men. Charles Allen was disgraced when it was made public that he had failed to pay child support, while Jake Whedon was publicly embarrassed for living with a woman for many years while unmarried. When Stansel was finally called to the stand, he testified that Thompson turned south down the sidewalk and then looked back, saying, "Maybe you're looking for something." Stansel said that he wasn't, at which point he said Thompson whirled and drew his gun, saying, "Well, if you are, I'll give it to you." Surprisingly, no other witnesses were able to corroborate that Thompson had said this. Many of Thompson's supporters believed that there had been a conspiracy among saloon owners and gamblers that resulted in his death. Curly McBride, owner of the Horseshoe, was questioned about suspicious behavior the day of the shooting. Someone claimed to have seen him nudging another saloon owner in a manner that indicated something was about to come off. McBride declined these suggestions when called to the stand. Lines of questioning like these showed that the prosecution was consciously attempting to expose a cover-up. But if one existed, they simply weren't able to uncover it.
Well, I would take a flying guess at it. I would say the majority thought the saloon capers were involved in the gambling interest and the girls all tied together. And I think they felt that they wanted to get Thompson out of the way so they could have free reign. We have to understand a different image of what gambling and prostitution was in that day. It was sinful, but yet it was profitable. And you wanted it, but you didn't want it.
Whether or not there was any conspiracy, the witnesses in the saloon block that day were more likely to be aligned with Stansel than they were with Thompson, potentially skewing the testimony to reflect more kindly on the marshal.
Oh, I think as far as the witnesses, I wouldn't have trusted them any farther than I could have picked up the local trolley and thrown it around, simply because they were all there drinking, or they had interest in it, or they were there gambling, and they were not a fan of anybody who was trying to clean it up and stop it. So they weren't going to make it look good at all for Thompson. Whether or not they really lied completely or just shaded the truth or expanded on it, I don't know. It's too late to ever find out now, but they had a vested interest in keeping the status quo, so to speak.
Despite overall testimony supporting Stansel's case, when medical experts for the prosecution were called to the stand to remark on Thompson's wounds, they testified that the wound to Thompson's chest was the result of a bullet that entered from the back. This starkly contrasted with consistent witness testimony that once Thompson had turned with the gun drawn, that neither man had turned away. One witness, however, raised the question that perhaps neither the sheriff nor the marshal shot first. A man by the name of J.D. Taliaferro testified that he saw a third person during the fight, who was described as a pale, tall, smooth-shaven man, and this man had a gun in his hand as he stood in the doorway of the El Morro.
Well, the real twist in the trial was J.D. Taliaferro's testimony. Other people were so concentrated upon watching Thompson and Stansel beating themselves with each other with the butt of their guns that no one but Taliaferro, because he was in the right position crossing the street, noticed the man in the doorway. So his testimony stood by itself, but it led a lot of interesting twists that perhaps there was a man, and the question, was this man representing one of the proprietors of the saloons? Were they taking their chance on the warning that they had been given to Thompson, that they would get even with him? And this crisis was the opportunity to do it, and to do it anonymously? No one knows.
The man was there long enough to fire 2 shots at Thompson's back. If he did, perhaps this would explain why so many people saw Thompson turn and draw his gun first, as he was turning to retaliate against Stansel for a shot that had actually been fired by another man.
Well, there's this story about a man who came out of the saloon, had a gun. Was he involved in it? Did he shoot? Was there more to this than meets the eye? And we don't know. He's the mysterious individual. He's the X factor in the mystery that we'll never be able to solve. If you push me to the wall, I think he was probably a person in there who heard the gunfight, heard the shots, and ran out to see if there was a robbery of the First National Bank, which was just down the block. So, I mean, you really can't say much to that one. He's an interesting possibility, but an X factor.
To complicate the trial further, there was another twist in the proceedings. It had been initially presumed that one of Thompson's stray bullets was the bullet that had struck John Accord, who was up the street in the direction Thompson was facing. But as it turned out, the bullet was too big to have come from the gun found on Thompson's body. The bullet would have fit the profile of Stansel's .45 revolver, but Stansel was facing south for the duration of the fight, as was the man in the doorway of the El Moro. So who shot John Accord? Either the sheriff truly did have his .45 revolver with him during the fight and it had been removed from the crime scene, or there had to have been another gunman. If there was another gunman, however, he had remained undetected. The closing scenes of the Stansel murder trial were witnessed by all the people who could possibly find a place to sit, stand, or hang onto the banisters of the stairway leading above. In the end, the contradictory testimony and lack of evidence led the jury to acquit Stansel of murder charges.
The fact that the mortician had destroyed the clothing, there was no evidence. There wasn't any answer to the guns. There wasn't an answer to the man in the doorway of the El Moro. And so the jury found Stansel not guilty and acquitted.
Thompson's supporters were very sad and very shocked because they thought it was a shooting, a cowardly shooting, an assassination is what the Thompsons called it, the family. An assassination of a man who was trying to uphold the law. So they were stunned.
Based on an overall compromise of the evidence in historical record, we can be certain that the gunfight unraveled quickly. So quickly that the multitude of witnesses around the scene may have been less able to determine the actual state of events than the two men between whom tensions were running so high that day. Descriptions of Thompson moving southward just before the fight with a grin on his face, knowing he had gotten underneath Stansel's skin, made people think the quarrel had ended. Thompson likely felt that he had come out on top and was good enough leaving the confrontation where it stood. He reportedly looked back over his shoulder as he walked away in case something should happen. Perhaps he saw Stansel begin to draw his gun. Based on witness testimony, it seems that Thompson surely was the quickest to shoot of the two men, but perhaps not necessarily the first to draw. Yet it may be possible that the jury concluded on the correct verdict all along, that Sheriff Thompson had reached a boiling point. Enraged and intoxicated, he turned to kill Jesse Stansel, only to miss all but one non-fatal shot, and instead to take 5 bullets himself, spelling an end to the sheriff and his anti-gambling crusade. Jesse Stansel would go on to complete the fiscal year with the Durango Police Department, even though many people opposed his return. Stansel left Durango the following year in 1907, taking up a job in law enforcement in Otero County, New Mexico. He eventually settled his family in El Paso, Texas, where he continued in law enforcement up until his death in 1939. Thompson's brother, George Thompson, was appointed sheriff in Durango and was determined to carry on his brother's fight to close gambling. Some descendants of Sheriff William Thompson still live in Durango, Colorado today. For local historians, the question still remains: who really did shoot first? Contradictory testimony, destruction of evidence, unexplained forensics left the outcome of the trial incomplete for many. It may forever remain an unsolved mystery, buried in the tumultuous past of the West.